Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Swastiastu. Good morning. Good morning to all honorable symposium participants. My name is Nugroho Indera Warman, or you can call me Nunu from UNICEF Indonesia. And I'm pleased and honored today as acting as the convener for the ECE Symposium as part of the conference. So as you might know, the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, is our current focus to transform the world. It surely starts from the early childhood education, or ECE, or PAUD, in Indonesia, with SDGs 4.2 as an important agenda. Measuring and evaluating early learning is a way to better progress the development of ECE. It is essential to measure young children's learning through a reliable assessment. A good quality assessment can be the tools for educators to produce accurate decisions to support their practice and further children's learning. So before we begin, I would like to invite the speakers to join me on the stage. Dr. Dan Cloney, Senior Research Fellow in ACER. David Jeffries, Research Fellow in ACER. And also joining with us from Australia, Kelly Picker, PhD, Research Fellow in ACER. Hi, Kelly. Can you hear me? Hey. Are you still on mute? Okay. But you can hear me, right? Okay, very good. So, thank you, gentlemen. So, Dr. Dan Cloney, so moving along to our first session, the first presenter is Dr. Dan Cloney. Dr. Dan Cloney is a Senior Research Fellow in the Education Policy and Practice Program at the Australian Council for Education Research, or ACER. Dan's research program focuses on the potential for high-quality early childhood education and care programs to support all children to flourish and to reduce development gaps caused by inequality. He is presenting using many measures of early learning to describe progress toward SDG 4.2.1, a case study using the Caregiver Reported Early Child Development Instrument, or CREDI. Dr. Dan, you will have 10 minutes to present, so the stage is yours.
Okay. Tight 10 minutes, only 25 slides, so let's get straight into it. Can I use this to progress the slide? Next slide. Okay, fantastic. I do want to start by saying that there are some common themes in the three papers we're going to talk about today. And really our agenda here is about innovation in early childhood assessment. And quite fortunately, our keynotes picked up some of the themes I want to hit on. John didn't say these words, so I'll put them into his mouth. What we're often interested in is reclaiming assessment for the classroom or for early childhood settings, and developing instruments that are useful for educators, but also give children the ability to demonstrate the skills and abilities they have, and to find out where they're going next. And because I've only got 10 minutes and I might not make it to the very last slide, I'll say the conclusion I come to is to say that it's better for us to develop those kind of assessments first, something that educators want to use, that gives them useful information, that helps them make purposeful, informed decisions in the classrooms, and then leave it to us. There are clever psychometricians, statisticians in this room. We can come up with the methods to then aggregate that data up and tell us how effective is the system, what kind of gain or value add are we getting out of early education programs. So that's where I'm going. And please feel free to email me, follow on Twitter, and if you do, use the hashtag ICAL 2022. Okay. So I'm starting from the point that we want to think about how might these kind of measures feed into the SDG agenda. We know we have now an SDG for early childhood that includes the idea of quality education and learning outcomes for children. It's quite a progression from the MDG agenda that was more about the provision of programs, enrolling children in programs. And inside early childhood, what we're interested in is, are children developmentally on track in their health, learning and psychosocial well-being? We have a measure. So UNICEF is the custodian for this indicator, and they've published the Early Childhood Development Index 2030, ECDI 2030. But there's some challenges with this because, is it really sufficient to have one measure for the globe? What if countries are not going to pick up and use this measure? What if they're already using something of their own that they think is fit for purpose in their country? And what about the other measures that are being developed by World Bank, UN agencies, Save the Children? We're going to talk about a few of those today, the MELQO and the CREDI. So I want to say we should do some work to start to think about how can we join up these measures, think about what is the actual construct that they are measuring. How can they, for example, be brought onto a common metric or some kind of learning progression? And most importantly, how can we connect the points along transitions, into preschool, maybe out of childcare, and into school? It's almost certainly true that if we're not achieving SDG 4.2, that we're certainly very unlikely to ever achieve SDG 4.1.1a, children being on track for reading and mathematics at grade 2 and 3. So what are we going to do here today? We're going to look at this CREDI instrument. Because this is an assessment conference, there is a theme around psychometrics. We're really going to focus in on the psychometric properties of it, consider whether it can be used reasonably well in Indonesia, whether we can use it to make international comparisons. And I'm going to have a bit of a go at saying, well, how would this fit into thinking about where children are in terms of the SDG 4.2.1 benchmarks? So, we recruited 700 odd children, ages 0 to 3, and we asked their parents to complete this measure, the CREDI instrument. It's 108 items. It's a lot of items for a measure. And the authors of this measure take a very classical approach and say, well, in order to reduce the burden, depending how old your child is, start maybe at item 11 if they're 1 year old, or start at item 39 if they're 2 years old. And tell us whether they can do a number of skills. Can they tie their shoelaces? Can they count to 10? These kinds of things. Yes, no, I don't know. Now, luckily, there is significant overlap between the CREDI instrument and the ECDI 2030. There are 12 common items in the measure. Now, they're not exactly the same, but I'm going to make the argument that actually they're substantively the same, and we can think about, well, if we know where they are on this CREDI instrument, then we can have some idea when children are 0, 1, 2 about where they might be later on in terms of the SDG 4.2.1 benchmarks. I'm going to just skip through some of this in the interests of expediency. We fit a item response model to the data, and we used fairly typical criteria to consider, are these good quality items? Before we did this, actually interestingly, we had to translate the instrument as well. So
We use the International Testing Commission standard procedures for that. So let's look at some results. What we have here is a person item map. The line through, the vertical line through the middle of the page is the scale, right? The CREDI scale, the Global Development Scale. And the red dots are the locations of the items. So how challenging is it for children to demonstrate these skills? And the density on the right-hand side there is the distribution of children in the sample that we drew, the 0-year-olds, the 1-year-olds, the 2-year-olds. And we use this kind of plot to look at things like, are we generating items that are well targeted to the children we want to respond to the items or their parents? And I guess from this picture I want you to take that the CREDI does a reasonable job at covering the construct. Perhaps we don't have very good items at the very top of the scale to cover children who are more developmentally advanced, but it's not a terrible picture. What we did do though, then we sort of wanted to say, well, how well can we use this to think about cross-national reporting or across different language groups. We were quite lucky the authors of the measure have already done some item response modelling and they published the item parameters. So what we were able to do is with our data fit our own, the same model to the data and then consider, in Indonesia, after translation, do we get the same item parameters out? And the answer is a little bit mixed. So on the y-axis here we have the author's published item parameters, how difficult are the items. On the x-axis we have our estimated item parameters. And a few of those items are deviating away from that unit line through the plot, which tells us that there's not good agreement between our analysis. But overall, the order of the items is maintained, the spread of items is maintained, and we're pretty happy with this. Some of those items that deviate very far from the unit line end up being deleted from our analysis. And of course, as we often find, even with a little bit of what we might consider diff, when we generate abilities, the authors here produce MAP estimates. We find that we get very similar ability estimates for the children. And again, what we find is whether we use the international item parameters or our item parameters, we get a very similar ordering of children's abilities on the measure. So we're pretty happy with that. And that said to us that we should progress and start to have a think about, well, what does the CREDI tell us in terms of where children might be in terms of the 2030 agenda? Now remember, we don't have all the ECDI 2030 items in the CREDI, and unfortunately we don't really have a good way of equating the measure because we don't have access to some CREDI, some ECDI data. And the ECDI uses raw scores to consider what is developmentally on track for learning at age 2 to 5, and we put them up there. So you have to score 7 out of 20, for example, to be considered developmentally on track when you're 2 years old, 11 out of 20 when you're 3, and so on. We did something quite simple. We just scaled down those benchmarks and said, well, we've got 12 items, so for 2-year-olds, for 3-year-olds, we can set a benchmark of 5 out of 12, and I thought 7 out of 12, but let's go with 6 out of 12. And then we said, well, look, in the sample of children that we drew, I mean, it's not a random sample, it's a convenience sample. We found that nearly 80% of 2-year-olds in Indonesia were meeting the benchmark, and 94 of 3-year-olds, very, very high figure. And we immediately asked the question, well, if this holds with the ECDI, I mean, are we happy with an international benchmark for the SDGs where, most children already meet the standard? We also had to think about where do the items that are from the ECDI 2030 fit and how well are they targeted. So again, Dave did this analysis and explained it to me last night because I was a bit confused, but he turns out he did a good job. He took the subsample of children that were 2 and 3 years old, fit the model and said, well, how well targeted are those 12 items? And it turns out that they're a little bit low. We don't get good coverage up the top. And this is kind of what we would expect if 80 and 90% of kids are endorsing these items and getting them right. In the whole thing? Okay. I've just been told I've gone way over time already. What did we find? Look, we found that the CREDI is a pretty robust measure. It holds quite well in Indonesia. The translation and adaptation process was successful. I think it's reasonable to go ahead and use the international item parameters to generate abilities and consider at a population level where Indonesia is compared to other countries. But I think most interestingly, we have generated a little bit of evidence that says the benchmarks for SDG 4.2.1, whether children are on track for learning, looks like they're going to be quite low, right? If 90% of kids or even 80% of kids are meeting those benchmarks by the time they're 3, it's very likely many more will get to them by their 4th and 5th birthday. And if our agenda is really about making sure kids are on track for learning, then we might want to reconsider whether we have the right benchmarks. And so we're very much looking forward to some data coming out using the ECDI 2030, and we would very much like to partner with our friends in Indonesia because they are generating some of this data to look at it and do the analysis. And I'll pass back there. Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much, Dr. Dan, for this comprehensive and inspiring presentation. So we have the second presentation will be presented by David Jeffries, PhD, with the topic of assessing children's learning trajectories outcomes using measuring early learning and quality outcomes, or MELQO. So David is a research fellow in the Education Policy and Practice, or EPP program, within the Education Monitoring and Research Division of the Australian Council for Education Research. His research interests are teaching and learning in science and mathematics, cognitive psychology, early child development, and large-scale assessment. To David, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. And firstly, to my co-authors, Dan, Diane, and Budiati Rahu, thank you for your support. And I'll just say a general thank you to particularly the ACER Indonesia team for all their help and support across the 3 papers as well. So given the time, we're definitely going to skip ahead with some of these and get to the important things. But just wanted to say that the program was implemented in Bogor. It was an intervention program by UNICEF with support from the government of Indonesia and the ICAL Foundation. And ultimately what they were trying to do is undertake some activities to try and find a way so that children were able to be involved in holistic and integrated early childhood development programs that would ultimately lead to better outcomes in school and at higher levels of education. The key activities of the program included training and on-the-job support and mentoring of teachers and educators. The people who were supporting those people were also given training in those direct intervention areas by UNICEF. And there was also an aspect of parental education that was undertaken as well. For those of you who don't know, the MELQO model is a measure of development and early learning, which was the assessment used for this particular study. And the reason it was chosen was because it was a direct assessment of children aged 3 to 6 years old. And the sample that we included, or that we started at the beginning of this study, were 5 and 6 year olds. and it covers a range of key early development domains, including maths, literacy, executive function, and social emotional development. And one of the other reasons why it was chosen is because it has been validated in a number of different country and language contexts as well. So the objective here was to apply IRT to the MELQO model and to use longitudinal methods to look at the developmental trends of children from a baseline in 2017-18 through to the end of 2019 at endline. So there were approximately 755-year-olds and 756-year-olds in the Bogor region that were included at baseline, and as many of those as possible were followed through to midline and again to endline. The MELQO model was used at each stage. Similar to the CREDI, there was a process of translation and adaptation, including the removal of some items that weren't appropriate for the cultural context. And there was an alignment of a number of key frameworks, including the MIX or MIX and the STPPA during the development of the instrument. And there was also the development of new items that were required as a result of the increasing development of children over time. I won't go into detail, but there were 10 dimensions included here that are all sub-dimensions of those 4 broad domains that I mentioned earlier, with a varying number of items included at for each dimension. And the analytical approach that we took was done in 3 stages, from a calibration to a conditioning model through to secondary data analysis. Our IRT was conducted using ACER Conquest, our in-house IRT software, and a number of key packages there in R used for secondary analysis. The calibration phase, we conducted a joint calibration where all of the items that were included in the assessment across all 3 phases were included in the one model, and a time facet was included to look at the change in abilities over time and the difficulty of the items. As per standard approach, items with inadequate properties were excluded, and we yielded, as I mentioned, 10 calibrated scales. Those item difficulty parameters were then used as anchors in the conditioning model, and a range of sampling and contextual data was added to a latent regression to build a population model, and then the time facet that was used in the first phase was removed and included in the conditioning phase as a separate dimension for each time point. And then, of course, secondary data analysis phase, we exported the plausible values from Conquest and did a range of models to look at the effects of treatment, implementation, and other contextual variables of interest for the study. So I won't go through the sort of basic psychometric results here. I'll just focus on a few key things. The first one is a box plot of, sorry, my writing's really small there, numbers and operations. So what you can see here is there was quite a big jump from baseline to endline. This was one of the largest increases in abilities relative to the standard deviation of the scale. Most of it was in that first phase from baseline to midline, but overall it was quite a large increase. The second one there is comprehension, and there was, while there was sort of positive increases at each point for all domains, this was one of our smallest relative to the SD of the scale. And the last one I'll highlight there is in writing and fine motor. While there were increases, you can clearly see that the variation in abilities from baseline is much wider than it is from midline, and even more so in endline, where the students are certainly bunched up much closer in their abilities by endline. And what Dan showed before was an item person map. It's just the reverse here, where we have the distribution of student abilities on the left-hand side of each figure, and then the location of the items in terms of their difficulty estimates on the right-hand side. And the one on the left is at baseline, and the one on the right is for endline, and this is for the comprehension domain. And this highlights the need to think critically about what items you're including at each stage of a longitudinal study. As you can see there, the items that were removed at endline down the bottom Not only were they probably too easy at baseline, but certainly by the time the kids grew by end line, those items were way below the distribution of abilities, and therefore they weren't included in the assessment at end line. And conversely, we had to add some items at end line in a few different domains to ensure that we were able to have some items providing information at the top half of the ability distribution by end line. Overall, the instrument's reliable and valid. Some items were less relevant in Indonesia, especially letter sounds. So it's important that when we're doing these types of things, we're thinking about the approaches that we're using that suit the particular cohort. For example, not all children might do the same items. In large-scale assessment, often, certain items might be different for different language groups, which we refer to as language-specific items, and there are other cases as well. And targeting is really important due to the longitudinal nature of the study, where we had to add more difficult items and remove sort of the easier items. For example, in mathematics, adding subtraction was done because addition was the only one used in the core test, so subtraction is more difficult than addition. And then finally, some future suggestions here is to think about international comparability. So there's a few things we could do following on from this study, and more broadly, we could publish the item parameters so that others can undertake studies of measurement non-invariance, which was something that was also recommended in the CREDI. To think about the types of things like whether the measures hold in other language and cultural contexts to further progress the use of the MELQO. And when we did the alignment of the MELQO with the STPPA, the MELQO, whilst it's a holistic measure, it doesn't cover all of the domains included in that framework. And things like art, creative thinking and problem solving aren't included in the MELQO. So we need to think about how we can improve this, and we invite Indonesian scholars to keep working in this space as well and keep progressing the literature in that area. And finally, which I think is a theme across our symposium, is how we can keep doing work to contribute to the reporting against SCG 4.2. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for this insightful presentation. Just on time. Apologize for the time concern. Okay, so we have this final presentation. This will be presented by Dr. Dan with Kelly Picker on the screen. Kelly Picker, PhD, is a research fellow for the Australian Council for Education Research. Her research concentrates on early childhood education with a particular focus on language and literacy development, the implementation of effective pedagogies for increasing learning, as well as teacher training and professional development. So the presentation will be what does learning look like, describing progression of oral language and literacy skills from a new formative assessment for early educators.
Great, I'm gonna lead off here just because there's a bit of like psychometric noise at the front that I'm going to talk about. But Kelly's going to jump in and talk about really the important stuff in this presentation, and I'm glad we got through the first two on time, because this is the best one. This is the meaty one. This is about really getting inside oral language. I think without a doubt many of us would consider oral language to be perhaps the most important learning domain for young children before they come to school. And we were fortunate enough to get an opportunity to develop a new measure that had all the kind of properties that we want them to have. We want it to be a highly engaging measure, something that is authentic, that asks children to demonstrate their skills around things they do every day in early childhood settings, reading picture books, telling stories, but still applying advanced psychometric techniques to it, so we can do things like adaptive testing, so we can do reporting against learning progressions, that kind of thing. And Kelly is an expert in early literacy pedagogy and did a lot of work developing the items and the activities, training our field workers, validating the test out in the field. So I'm really pleased she's been able to join us, and at the next ICAL she'll be here in person with us, perhaps also showing another measure we've developed in numeracy or mathematical literacy. So I did want to pick up this idea that, you know, really at the end of the day, assessment is for children and for teachers. It's something that we want them to engage in and use to inform their practice. Many of you who are familiar with the early childhood field and assessment in the early childhood field will know that we don't do that very well at all. Most early educators are exposed to narrative style assessment in their preparation. They're very good at collecting evidence, pictures, writing narratives. And there are very, very few tools available to them, measures that could formalise those observations into reporting against learning progressions, for example. And in fact, most of the measures come from the psychological tradition, and teachers are not even allowed to use them, right? They're required a professional certification in psychology before they can use them. So we can do much, much better in this space. I do want to make a little bit of an ambit claim here that you know, one of the challenges we have in early childhood is we are excellent and we recognise the importance of holistic learning. The STPPA here, the curriculum for early years here, does a great job at declaring that it's not just academic learning. There's a broad range of skills we want children to develop. We want them to do it in play-based sort of settings. But we mustn't get confused with that word holistic to imagine it means one thing. We can't smush together all of children's learning into one construct or measure. These are discrete domains. They're correlated, certainly, but we need to think quite distinctly and prioritise what are the outcome domains that we want teachers in early childhood to develop in young children, and give them tools that are well suited to those domains. And of course, this is why we've focused in on oral language in this case. I've added a point there too that, you know, assessment is in many ways about giving children an opportunity to demonstrate what they can currently do, and to give them some feedback about where they might go next, to generate evidence about what teachers will do in supporting that learning. Again, many early childhood assessments are one form with 10 or 20 items on them. And if we ask teachers to report against the same measures or children to do the same activities again and again, it's boring, right? And of course, we have the tools now to do assessment in the classroom in a way that, you know, each time a child comes to the assessment, it's a new activity, a new experience for them. And so we can move past that sort of old school way of thinking. In this piece of work, we're really interested in, you know, definitely validating a strong, good quality measure. But where we want to go with it eventually is make sure we have a learning progression in oral language and literacy development that does predominantly one thing, and that gives teachers a common language to talk about learning. It's very important in the early years that, you know, across transitions, you know, the TK programs here, they might be taking children out of childcare and going into school later on. I put it to you that teachers in schools and teachers in early learning settings do not have a common language to talk about progress. And if we can think about this more purposefully and develop tools that give them this language, it's one of the ways that we can build the skills of the early childhood workforce and build some esteem in the sector, and so that people recognise that they're playing a really important job in setting up the learning of children that then carries on into school. So this is the kind of thing that we did. I'm over this side now. We developed a big pool of items over 5 years that covered, you know, items of these sub-dimensions from oral language, comprehension, fluency, And what we did is we validated the measure in a sample of about 550 children in a very disadvantaged community in Australia. Like in the previous papers, we used item response modelling to calibrate a measure, choose what we thought were the best items, and then describe a learning progression. And what we did with that assessment is we used it to do on-demand formative assessment in early childhood settings. And Kelly took a wonderful team out into the field and trained early childhood educators and school teachers to do the assessment and to collect the data. And there's a little box there that says population study. That's kind of my conclusion where I'm going at the end of this, where I'm going to say, well, actually, if educators are doing really good quality assessment and prioritising it in their practice, then we can be clever enough to work out what's going on in the system from that, at least to some level of precision. One thing we were able to do, of course, is because this was longitudinal validation, because we had these nice item response models, is we could go ahead and the same sort of things going on here as in the other presentations. We have the oral language scale from low down the bottom of the page to high up the top of the page. We were able to draw the distribution of abilities of the children in the studies in red when they were in childcare and kindergarten, and in green when they were in kindergarten and the first year of school, and in blue up the top when they were in grade 2 and grade 3. And I'm sorry, on my Mac, that's delightfully shaded in so you can make it out. I hope you can sort of see the difference. It is the younger children here down the bottom, the middle-aged children up here, and then the older children up the top. And of course, we can also have a look where the items are. And I guess what I want you to take out of this picture is the tremendous overlap in the distribution of abilities. And so we're looking at 5 years of development here. But we see children who are in childcare settings and in preschool at the top of the distribution who are demonstrating the kind of skills we observe in children in grade 2 and grade 3 at the bottom of the ability distribution, and vice versa. And so whether you're a childcare worker, a preschool educator, or a school teacher, it's certainly true that just like in the older ages and grades in school, there is a really wide range of abilities that you're going to have to deal with. And without good quality measures to give you some idea about what's going on with this child today, it's really hard to expect that a teacher could look at a curriculum document or some sort of description of an age or a stage and really do effective teaching for children in classrooms. The other thing that I wanted to mention is I've plotted some of the items from the scale as a bit of evidence about what kind of skills we're seeing at different levels. And it's worth noting that that item up the very top, this comprehension item, this is a literal comprehension item. Children read a storybook with an adult, and at the end they see the last page and they're asked to simply recount, why were the children happy at the end of the story? It's a literal comprehension item. And in this subpopulation, really only the highest ability children in grade 2 and grade 3 were starting to do this. And if you look in the Australian school curriculum at grade 2 and grade 3, we would expect this is a much lower order skill. So again, for this subpopulation, if we're doing effective teaching, we really need to know something about the children and decouple ourselves from the curriculum. And Kelly, do you want to try speaking? Is there any chance we've got you back? No, I'm sorry. I promise you Kelly would have told you a wonderful story about developing oral language and literacy items, but I am mindful we're quite over time, so maybe we'll wrap it up. Sorry, Kelly. Thank you for dialing in, and maybe you can stay on the line because we'll have a Q&A session, and even if we can't hear you, perhaps you can type furiously to contribute to the conversation.
Okay.
Sorry, I just have one more slide to wrap up.
So thank you so much, Dan. This is good. Okay, so thank you for all the speakers for addressing these interesting topics on early childhood education, all the measurement and also the finding from baseline and other assessment. And apologize for the technology constraint, but now we will enter the Q&A session. So like usual, please raise your hand if you have any question, and please mention your name and which institution that you come from. Okay, we will have like first 3 questions from the right side. Do we have any? Yes, 1, 2, in the middle. Okay, in Malaysia. Okay, that one. Okay, we have 3 participants that will raise a question. Yes, please.
Hello. So my name is Cici. I'm from Inspirasi Foundation. So I have a question about MELQO. So David. So you mentioned that MELQO.
Sorry.
If I'm not mistaken.
Can you? Maybe you can open it. It's not clearly for us here. Sorry. Apologize for that one. Yes. Thank you.
So if I'm not mistaken, so MELQO consists of 2 parts, the model and the melee. And the result that you have shown cover only on child development. And so I'm curious about the part that shows about the quality of the learning environment, because that's the learning take place. So I'm curious about that. And also about the first speaker related to, so actually it's surprising for me because like the CREDI is on Likert scale on, if I'm not mistaken, so like yes, no, or, and I think there are 3 scales, and your finding is like the instrument is valid. So, and what I often found having an instrument that use Likert scale in Indonesia are the results are often estimate. So I'm just wondering what's your view on the overestimate result on using CREDI. And I'm actually want to have your guys' perspective on the IDELA, another instrument that also focus on the early childhood developments.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's okay. I might try and answer all of that. I am also very, very interested in observational measures of classroom quality, pedagogy, the learning environment. We did use the melee in that study, but we haven't reported it. I think my experience has been that it is incredibly challenging to get good quality measurement of teaching quality in situ. We found a really strong correlation with the environment measure from the MELQO and children's learning outcomes. But really we ended up just using items like, do you run a literacy instruction program as part of your daily programming? Do you read to children? And we see that in the international literature too. In fact, we always end up falling back on measures like how many books are in the home and simple measures like that, whereas more sophisticated measures like the classroom assessment scoring system are, I think, conceptually better, theoretically better, but are incredibly expensive and difficult to use. So we kind of have some idea about the headline indicators, what's important for early educators to do. But I don't think we have a sophisticated measure that would tell us much about the quality of teaching in early childhood yet. And I guess I would pass that over to you to develop and keep working on. My opinion on the IDELA, let's Save the Children's measure of children's early learning, is much the same as it is of the MELQO. They are very, very similar measures. They are good quality conceptual measures that have been developed from first principles around like an omnibus measure of children's early skills, early numeracy, literacy, social and emotional skills, executive function.
But they haven't yet taken the next step to say, well, is this more than a monitoring and evaluation tool? You know, they are fixed forms of limited sets of items. They're pretty boring for kids. You know, I don't think you'd bring it into the classroom as a daily or, you know, a kind of instrument that you want to use as part of your practice. But they do have an important role at the population level, at the monitoring and evaluation level, and I think we can improve them so that they can fit into the SDG reporting agenda. But I do think we need to be much better and more mindful about developing instruments that teachers will want to use as part of their practice and that are a bit more interesting. Did I miss a part? I think, also around the CREDI finding. My sense that finding that most kids meet the ECDI 2030 benchmarks, we shouldn't be surprised by that. My recollection is UNICEF has done some work on the previous mix early childhood measure and found that 70–80% of children meet that standard. Less focused on learning, but I think typically we probably target too low when we think about, you know, what are the minimum standards we want children to achieve. I think there's a nice idea there to say that maybe we need a minimum standard, but then also have a think about, well, what's our aspirational target for children to have? And picking up some of John's work, you know, what's a reasonable amount of growth for a child to experience? And I think we could probably plug that into the SDG 4.2 and 4.1 link and say, well, you know, when children are 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, what's our expectation about how much they grow and develop? Right, don't worry about where they are on the actual scale, but from wherever they start, how much do we expect them to grow? And have they done that? Right? And if they haven't, have we changed anything? Have we changed practice in the classroom? Have we thought about policy or targeting within the village or at the provincial level? I think that's where we have to go to be a bit more aspirational.
Thank you, Len. So the second question from the right side. Yes. Can you give the microphone to him? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Yoris Kartakusuma. I'm from the Ministry of Education. I really interested in Jeffries. Since Indonesia consists for 514 districts, you make a research in Bogor. There's a few I want to ask about why UNICEF choose Bogor as a location. And then the next, maybe I missed from your presentation, is there any crucial or maybe urgent issues that can be addressed for Indonesian children? That very interesting. And since in 2045, Indonesia will have a bonus, demographic bonus, is there any interesting issues can you uplift from your research that you've done in Bogor? And the third question, is there any UNICEF plan to make the research in a larger scale, since Indonesia is not only Bogor, maybe there's 514 districts in Indonesia? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I'll come back to the first one for Dan to maybe answer. But certainly, the reason that we chose those sites for this study is because UNICEF were having direct intervention in that area. So it made sense certainly to choose schools from those sites as our intervention sites. And the second question was... Sorry?
The results of the intervention.
Yeah, so we didn't focus on looking at that in this particular presentation. We didn't have time to talk about what difference there was in the intervention sites, but what happens in most of these things is often you'll see that there's some catching up of certain groups, and it was different for each domain. We looked at sort of the developmental trajectory of children in the sites from the treatment to the control groups. And so at times, some of those sites started ahead and remained ahead. For other dimensions, there was, they did well to catch back up because they started behind. So be happy to talk to you after about the specifics of each dimension and what happened. And we've got a much larger report that's a UNICEF report that we can talk to you about. Yep. And then the third one was about applicability to other regions. The demographic part, yeah.
I'll pick up the last bit there about the demography of Indonesia, and you know, it is a wildly diverse country. Certainly we are very interested in doing larger scale work, and the team at ACER Indonesia, led by Bulani up the front here, we're doing sort of work in Sumba as well as on Java, but of course always looking for partners to take on larger work, and certainly it's focused around strengthening, approaching or achieving SDG 4.2. It's something we want to do. Almost certainly the most interesting findings from the Bogor piece of work, which I think almost certainly translates across all of the regions, is that the children who fared by far the worst were those who did not go to any early childhood program. They were way behind their peers at the start of the study, and Dave rightly says they caught up a little bit, but by the time they were in the second year of school, they were still massively behind. Effect sizes bigger than 1 and 2 in some cases. I think comprehension in particular was very, very poor. So there is a significant need to get children into early learning programs, and there is a cultural, an education culture challenge there as well. When we speak to parents, one of the common findings is they're not yet convinced by the play-based, holistic and integrative policy. They are much more interested in getting their children into school and literate and numerate. I think many of us here would know that it's true that although the school starting age here is 7, many children are in school by the time they're 4 and 5 and 6. And that's a realisation of that gap between policy, you know, that we have this holistic, integrated, play-based early childhood program, and the reality that there's still a very strong desire for children to read and to write very early on. And I think that's a massive challenge, in addition to growing participation in TK programs at age 5 and 6.
Okay, thank you so much. So we still have one question from the left side. Probably just make it brief here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Diah Wihadini. I'm from BINUS University in Jakarta. So I was actually involved in the development of a similar instrument called DRDP. A few years ago, developed by the California State Department of Education and the Berkeley Evaluations and Assessment Research Center. So my understanding why such instrument exists is because the CDE has provided and will always have to provide an enormous investment and also financial support for their early childhood education by again providing highly subsidized child care facilities. So of course their government would like to know whether their money are very well spent, right? But in Indonesia, I haven't seen any initiative in such kind, and also whether our governments are actually willing to do so in the future. So So I'm just wondering if you can let us know what actually the ultimate objective of developing such measures in Indonesia. And yeah, we would like to know about it. Thank you.
Yes. Well, look, I think without a doubt, and this is my opinion, so maybe not without a doubt, I should say, in my opinion, the reason why we develop these measures is nearly always to measure exactly what you say, right? We want to know, hey, we've spent $10 million, $100 million, $1 billion on some investment, and we want to know if after that things got better. But I put it to you that that's secondary priority, I think, and it is driving us to develop measurement and assessment that is either just not available to educators or not attractive to educators to use. And I think if we started to think more conceptually about measurement and saying, well, we've got all these different tools that we've developed to measure, literacy, for example, we could have a think about, do they measure the same thing? Can we bring them back onto some common metric? Can we start to describe what's going on there? Can we break down the delineation between these measures, and can we build new things for teachers to do and to work with children that exist on the same measure, and then go back to first principles and say, well, this is about generating evidence about what children can do today and what they can do tomorrow, and for us to evaluate ourselves in terms of, did we do a good job? And out of that, I think, again, the very clever psychometricians and statisticians here can then go and take that data and then also do the kind of value add analysis that you're talking about. But I think it's certainly clear the measures we have developed up till today in early childhood are not serving the purpose we want them to do, and that is to generate really good evidence in the classroom that teachers and children actually use.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan. Do you still have, yes, Kelly's still there. Are we already connected with her? Not yet. Okay, so once again, I apologize for this technological things. But however, thank you so much for the presenters here. I will not make a recap because the time is already up. But I think, as presented by all of the presenters here, that there is much to do to make sure there is true global effort to report on the early childhood education outcomes today. Yeah? And so I thank you to Dan, David, and also Kelly, and the members of the symposium for a productive session today. And give one round of biggest applause for the speakers. Thank you so much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.